Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. In early December, leaders from almost 200 nations gathered in an attempt to tackle the issue of climate change. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP21, was held in Paris over 2 weeks and resulted in the Paris Agreement, a deal in which countries will work to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and keep global temperatures from increasing by 2 degrees Celsius. By keeping temperatures from increasing that amount, people may be able to avoid cataclysmic changes to the Earth predicted by scientists, including huge rises in sea levels, increasingly powerful superstorms, and widespread drought. But there is concern among some environmentalists, scientists, and even world leaders that the damage is already done and that the Paris deal is too little, too late. 2015 is set to become the hottest year since global temperature records began being measured in 1880. It will eclipse the current record holder, which was 2014. On this edition of Global Journalist, we're going to try to unpack the Paris Agreement and talk about what may be done next to head off climate change. Joining us today from San Francisco, Chris Anderson. He's Deputy Director of the Climate Science Program at Iowa State University. From Toronto, Stephen Scharper, a professor of anthropology who studies environmental ethics at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And from Washington, D.C., David Doniger, Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Climate and Clean Air Program. Welcome to all of you. Chris Anderson, you know, for a long time, many people talked about this issue of climate change as something that is going to happen in the future. What are some of the effects that are taking place right now that around the globe? How are we being impacted now by this problem?
Well, the most notable effects are in the northern latitudes down into the middle latitudes, where the temperature effect has been the largest. And at this point, we have seen in areas that span from Siberia into northern Canada and central Canada, across Alaska, begin to show signs of the land thawing out and show cooling. And that's in addition to the Arctic warming that we've also seen and had a lot of press about. Other areas where it is very clear that changes have occurred already are in typically wet areas and typically dry areas. They are already showing signs of wet areas becoming wetter and dry areas becoming drier. The wet areas are particularly problematic in the central part of America and across the tropical zone, because that allows for new types of diseases to be spread more rapidly by vector-borne insects and vector-borne diseases.
So in other words, you were saying some wetter areas are becoming wetter, and this is helping spread some plant diseases, some animal diseases then, is that correct?
Well, these are actually diseases carried by insects. So it could be things like West Nile virus and newer diseases that are carried by mosquitoes that are becoming more prevalent.
Well, Steve Scharper, let me turn this to you. We talked just briefly about the Paris Accords earlier in the introduction. Remind our listeners about the two other big climate conferences that have taken place in the recent past. First, there were this meeting in Kyoto in 1997 that led to the Kyoto Accords. Then more recently, there was this big meeting in Copenhagen, I believe you attended back in 2010, where there wasn't such a successful outcome. What was sort of the legacy of those two big meetings?
Well, after the Copenhagen Accord, this was when Kyoto was going to be extended, and it ended in failure with great acrimony. There was no deal reached, and there was a cobbled-together group of major nations at the end with China, India, the United States, and Brazil, trying to just kind of put together a commitment to not have greenhouse gas emissions to the extent of increasing over 2 degrees centigrade. But it was a failure. And so this was, in a sense, a litmus test. Can the international community come again together, salvage the pieces of Kyoto, and have a binding agreement from all major players on climate change? They were able to do this, and it's quite extraordinary. 195 nations met, and it's the first time an international agreement has been in consensus approved by China, the United States, and 193 other nations. So it's a very strong success. It hasn't been ratified officially until 55 nations sign on to it. And those 55 nations have to represent 55% of greenhouse gas emissions. On Earth Day in New York, the United Nations has invited nations to come for a formal signing ceremony. So individual nations have to seek ratification and then sign the agreement. But this is still a unanimous consensus, which is quite extraordinary at this level.
Well, let me turn this to David Doniger then. Professor Scharper was just talking about sort of the accomplishment of getting so many different nations to agree on a single goal. Let's talk about some of the specifics of the agreement. The first, perhaps the top line aspect of this agreement is that all these nations agreed to try to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, many scientists have said this may actually not be enough to head off some of the worst aspects of global climate change, and that threshold should be much lower. What's your take on this?
Actually, one of the most remarkable things about the meeting was the emphasis that it should be well below 2 degrees, and there's a need for shooting for 1.5 degrees maximum. That was a demand of island countries, of other countries that are really seriously in jeopardy. And the United States and many other countries backed that new target. But the action elements of this agreement are the most important. Every country brought a domestic commitment. They add up to not enough to cut emissions to meet that 2-degree level, but about half or more of the temperature increase that would happen without this agreement can be cut off. So we're a long way towards the objective. And then the important part of this agreement is that countries committed to get together every 5 years and up their game by improving those national plans, by cutting emissions more. So this is just the beginning. This is the floor. We have to build on it. We have to do what we committed to do and then commit to more.
Chris Anderson, from your point of view, what was sort of the big picture significance of these accords as it relates to the United States working with China in particular and India in making these talks a success? How significant was that?
Well, the importance of working together between the United States and China and India gets at the heart of who's responsible for what. We are all aware that India and China are growing rapidly, but science has shown that it's the cumulative effect of greenhouse gases that has the most impact. And so up to date, about 60% of the cumulative greenhouse gases has come from the United States, North America, or the North America, European Union, and Australia, and that group of developed countries. And so we shoulder much of the blame for the near future. At the same time, we don't want to allow other countries to then undermine the efforts that are going on in North America, Australia, and European Union. So in order to have both values, the value of wanting undeveloped countries to continue to develop, and the value of developed countries to pay their share, they had to come to agreement, and doing the work beforehand is what really made, I think, a lot of this agreement possible.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at the recent global accord on climate change reached in Paris and the prospects for heading off a catastrophic rise in global temperatures. Our guest this week, Chris Anderson, Assistant Director of the Climate Science Program at Iowa State University, Stephen Scharper, a researcher who studies environmental ethics at the University of Toronto, and David Doniger, Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Climate and Clean Air Program. Now, Steve Scharper, some had expected that one of the key aspects of this climate deal is that it would lay the groundwork for an emissions trading scheme whereby countries could get sort of certain credits for either taking carbon out of the air or polluting less. Countries like Congo or Brazil, by preserving their rainforests, which absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, could then sort of trade that credit with another country that, say, has a coal-burning power plant that puts a lot of CO2 into the air. What was the outcome of this agreement with respect to setting up sort of this international market that would allow for these types of reductions?
Well, there was an agreement not in the formal Paris Accord, but an agreement among about 100 nations to work together at some level for some type of carbon pricing schema. There's a debate about the benefits of carbon pricing or carbon tax, for example, versus cap and trade. But there was an international interest and dedication by approximately 100 nations to explore this in some kind of organized fashion. So that was considered hopeful. But on a larger note, as was indicated by David, this is a very important target to try and reach 1.5 rather than 2, even though it's not completely wedded to that. There's that striving for. In a sense, what this does is open a green light to the green economy. And this is now going to incentivize throughout these nations ways of finding a cut in emissions in industry, business, all aspects of the federal portfolio. So it's kind of a level playing field that businesses have wanted for a long time. And carbon pricing, carbon taxing, they're going to be part of that mix.
And David Doniger, one of the issues also addressed in this accord is this issue of sort of transparency as to who is emitting what and where and how much. What did the Paris Accords do precisely about that? If we in the U.S., say, are making cuts, if we're putting insulation into our homes or buying smaller cars or getting rid of coal-burning power plants, how do we know that people in other parts of the world are making the same changes?
Well, this agreement has stronger provisions for reporting, for transparency, for countries to look over each other's shoulder and inspect each other's performance than we've ever had before. And these are equally agreed for the developed and the developing countries. There's to be a little flexibility for a subset of developing countries, quote, who need it, meaning the flexibility. But every country agreed to be forthcoming with reporting and to have some degree of...
Some developing countries, they won't have sort of the same set of standards for transparency as those in industrialized countries.
The big ones will. The big industrial countries, you know, China has just as much capability as we do to track the fuel use and the emissions in its power plants, and it's committed to do this now. There are some small developing countries that might not have the infrastructure, and where it might not be as critical. It's of course with the biggest emitters to have exactly the same transparency regime. But this is huge that the developing countries agreed basically to be held to the same standard with a little flexibility rather than to a totally different standard or no standard at all.
Chris,
and this is emblematic. This is emblematic of the higher level of cooperation that we're getting from the key developing countries. China knows that they have got big threats ahead of them from climate change. They put out a report just before this meeting about how sea level threatens the highly urbanized southeastern coast, and how drought threatens their agricultural regions, how the glaciers that they count on to feed the big rivers are retreating. And of course their humongous air pollution problem. They know that they have to act, and they're committed to act now too.
So in other words, then, there seems to be some acknowledgement that their economic future is bound up in addressing climate change now, even if that may mean some sacrifices in the near term.
Well, I don't think they think of it as sacrifice. Right now, they're sacrificing their health big time with the worst smog in Beijing and in New Delhi. And the rising middle class in both of those countries is demanding something that we take for granted, namely air that you can't taste. Air that you don't have to, air that you can see through.
Well, this is a good point, David, and I'd like to turn this to Chris Anderson then, because David was talking about sort of the role of the rising middle class in some of these large developing countries like India and in China. And one aspect of what happens when countries develop is that people change their diets and people increasingly eat more meat, they eat more dairy. And we do know that agriculture plays a huge role in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly the livestock sector. There was a report out last year showing that the livestock sector alone accounts for more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transport sector, than cars, than automobiles, than trains. What do we do about this issue, this problem of people's changing diets?
Well, I think this is a really important question to ask because, first of all, it gets back to the question of, might we undermine our own efforts at preventing climate change? If the report that came out raises two issues. One is the issue of how well can we actually measure our greenhouse gas emissions, and that was addressed a little bit with the idea of being able to transfer the transparency reporting models from the developed countries to the developing countries. For instance, in the United States, our agricultural contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is about 10%. And it might be if we are able to transfer our technology to estimating greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture in China, we might have a better estimate and know whether, in fact, our animal agriculture is producing closer to 50% of the worldwide greenhouse gas emissions as reported in the World Watch Institute report, or closer to the early reports back in 2006, which had it at about 18%. The second aspect of that is in the United States, I think we are definitely showing that we can do agriculture, animal agriculture in a sustainable way. And today's...
I'm sorry, we lost connections with you, Chris. While we try to reconnect with you, let me turn this to Steve Scharper, because there was another aspect of this which is key, because it hits everyone in industrialized countries in the pocketbook, and that is this idea that industrialized countries had committed to paying $100 billion a year to developing nations to help them cope with the effects of global climate change. How have the Paris Accords changed those commitments? Are we seeing that this promised money is actually materializing or is going to materialize?
Well, there seems to be much more of a commitment to have it materialize. So there's varying reports of how this is accounted for. One says 33 billion of that has already materialized. Another report says 66 billion of that has materialized. The United States doubled their commitment. Canada committed 2.65 billion just before the Paris Accord. I think what's happened now is...
So wait, when you say that some of this money is there, like, is it in an account somewhere, or are these promises on paper from governments?
That I'm not sure of. I don't know if they have an account or it's a kind of transfer that has a UN stamp on it. That I'm not sure of. I'm just reading from some of the other reports about where this is going. But I think it is channeled through the UNFCCC, through the United Nations body on climate change. But what I think is important now is the shaming factor is higher. That there was a huge commitment to make agreement happen, which was not the case in Copenhagen. I think the Pope has had a role in this, in raising this to a moral issue. So there is a greater accountability even among the people within the nations themselves, as well as the larger international community, to make this happen, both in terms of the target agreements in terms of emissions, or at least the attempts to keep emissions low, but also in the need to provide money for nations who are lesser developed not to destroy their ecosystems. India wants to electrify, for example. They say, well, they're going to go ahead. If you don't want us to use coal, you have to pay up. So there's countries that are actually articulating what they're going to do if they do not get that money. It impacts agriculture as well. A lot of the rainforests, of course, in the nations of the South are being destroyed for cattle raising. Countries can say, as some have, if you don't want us to do that, give us the funding so that we can have an alternative economic model. So that is going to be ratcheted up after Paris, that kind of conversation.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at the issue of climate change in the wake of the Paris Climate Change Conference, which wrapped up in mid-December. Our guest this week, Chris Anderson, Assistant Director of the Climate Science Program at Iowa State University, Stephen Scharper, a researcher who studies environmental ethics at the University of Toronto, and David Doniger, Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Climate and Clean Air Program. A reminder that if you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. David Doniger, one issue that Steve Scharper was just touching on was this shaming factor. But I wanted to ask you about the commitments made at Paris. They're viewed as voluntary commitments. And so to a cynic, that might suggest that it's almost inevitable that some, perhaps even many countries aren't going to fulfill the voluntary commitments that they've made. What do you make of that?
Well, first, there's two aspects of this. First, all international agreements are fundamentally political contracts, political agreements. And there is no Supreme Court of the world. There is no court you can go to enforce an international agreement. they have to be the commitments made to countries in the nature of contracts. And I will if you will. And I'll keep doing it if you keep doing it. And that's the basis of this kind of agreement. There's also an important aspect in terms of the United States system. If the way this agreement is written, the president can enter it without needing a new round of congressional sign-off. And that's because this is an agreement that elaborates the commitments already made in the 1992 treaty, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that the U.S. Senate already gave consent for the U.S. to ratify. But if you write an agreement now that has to go before the Senate, then the Republican opponents of doing anything about climate change could scupper the global deal. And this agreement does not have to go before the Congress. This agreement can go forward on the basis of the commitments we've already made and on basically this political deal between all the big countries that I will move forward if you move forward. And that's the way we've got to go.
Well, Chris Anderson, greenhouse gas emissions have risen about 40% from 1990 to the current day. How are countries going to meet these commitments that they're making to reduce emissions? Is there likely to be kind of a single template for what each country around the world can do, or are we going to see sort of a different set of approaches for people in different places?
Well, a single template is not going to be the case. And that, I think, is what is the very great advantage of what was agreed upon in Paris. It allows the solutions to come from region-specific solutions that work really best in those particular regions. So what the Paris Conference does, it allows us to be creative as human beings. It puts the onus on our ingenuity. And I'm really optimistic, especially about local power generation, local electricity generation in developing countries. I know that there is a large entrepreneurial effort to begin to look into that and to begin to make that happen. And with an accord in place, that allows not only for the imagination to go in that direction, but also for nations to build the policies that allow those entrepreneurial efforts to flourish.
Well, Steve Scharper, David Doniger had been talking about the sort of voluntary nature of this agreement and said that it was in part driven by sort of U.S. domestic political and legal concerns. Republicans in Congress and many of those running for president have been quite critical about the science of climate change and about President Obama's participation in these Paris Climate Accords. How likely is it that the U.S. is going to fulfill what the Obama administration has pledged if there's a Republican president in 2017 in the United States? Are those commitments going to vanish?
That's a thorny question, and a lot of people were concerned about it in Paris. My sense is, though, that there's a consensus even among people in North America, including the United States, outside the hard right Republican Party, who are seeing the effects of climate change, who are interested in the entrepreneurial opportunities that this moment affords, and they want to join the race to a good life. As my colleague Matt Hoffman, who also attended this from the Political Science Department, attended Paris, says, this is signaling not a race against one country against the other. It's a race to stop catastrophic climate change and a race to envision and implement a good life, a better life, a life of health, of sustainability, of new relationships with our environmental systems, with our ecosystems, etc. And I think people in the United States want that as much as the international community, despite what happens with the political leadership in the next election.
David Doniger, you heard Steve Scharper being quite optimistic there. What's your view?
Well, I agree with this because when you poll the American people, 2/3 of the American people wanted, ahead of this Paris Agreement, wanted the U.S. to enter an international agreement to address climate change. And 2/3 of the American people support the domestic actions like curbing power plant emissions and curbing vehicle emissions and raising fuel economy, which the Obama administration has done. And support for these actions approaches 50%, even among Republicans. So it seems as though what's going on now is in the U.S. system is a pitch in a primary season to the hard right, and these candidates run the risk of marginalizing themselves because they're so far out of step with the the preferences of the general public. And it's those people who will elect the next president.
Well, Chris Anderson, on this same subject then, what have you seen the reaction has been from fossil fuel companies in particular to these agreements? We do know, sort of for unrelated reasons, that commodity prices for things like oil, natural gas, coal, they're at their lowest level in more than a decade. And so that sort of changes the economics of changing to renewable energy sources. What effect does this have on our ability to impact this problem, and how does sort of lower prices alter the dynamic for the economy?
Well, that's right. The importance of that question is, how does the current energy system that relies on oil and coal shift to a renewable energy system? There's already substantial infrastructure, there's substantial capital, there are substantial markets, and the question is, how will the big energy players change and how will they respond? Well, so far there have been a few that have the ability to get into natural gas very quickly and capitalize on a market sector that they can kind of corner. And they have been very open to allowing for this type of agreement to occur so that there would be a market response, and that would allow them to go after the natural gas resources that they want to develop. As the price of wind and solar continue to go down, these companies also, large companies also have initiatives in renewable energy that will become more price competitive. And in fact, the tax bill in the United States that extends the credits for development of wind and solar is expected to have, with a $25 billion credit over the next 5 years, an investment of $75 billion in wind and energy development projects. So it'll be a substantial shift. It'll be, in the United States, a very dramatic shift, I believe, over the next 5 years.
Well, Steve Scharper, our time grows short. We do have less than a minute left. So what will happen at the next climate meeting in 5 years when countries have to come back? Is that going to be an inflection point where people can really take a look and say, are we making enough progress? What do you see happening in the future?
Well, the next meeting is next year in Marrakesh, and I think at that point, people are going to be kind of taking stock of what's happened, and I think we're going to see, as the other guests have articulated, a bit of an explosion in creativity. I think entrepreneurially, in terms of incentivizing economies, we're going to see a lot of creative energy. Also, we haven't talked about carbon capture, organic carbon capture through biochar, through seaweed cultivation, etc., that Timothy Flannery has written about in his new book, Atmosphere of Hope, as holding great promise for carbon capturing sequestration. So I think we don't know, but I think these energies are now unleashed, and they might prove very positive for the next meetings.
That's going to have to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Chris Anderson, Stephen Scharper, and David Doniger for coming on the program. Global Journalist executive producer is Josh Kransberg. Our associate producers this week are Lakshana Mehta, Chiwei Chu, Urjun Peng, and Joe Hang. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.